Here we are with Patrick Williamson, a poet and a translator. And in that case, translator from two different source languages also, French and Italian. So thanks, Patrick, for joining us in our celebration of the Antonym Translation Month.
Thank you for the invitation, Biswadip. Very kindly.
So we would like to understand, as you are a poet, but you actually translate quite a lot. Why do you translate? What is the motivation?
Well, there are several reasons, really. I like to translate poems if they have an impact and something to say, i.e. a message to get across to other people. So that's one. When I'm selecting poems, that's one of the criteria that I use.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I like once I have a poem in hand, whether it's one that I've chosen myself or somebody has asked me to translate, I like to try to recreate the same effect and message in a poem in English. So more readers, English-speaking readers, can enjoy the poem, etc. There's also an intellectual challenge when translating poetry in particular, in trying to find the mot juste, the right word for the right idea and sentiment in the poem. And sometimes it's, you do a bit of research, sometimes these words suddenly appear out of the subconscious, and I find that very stimulating. I like also to transfer the message, and there's an overall satisfaction in creating a new poem using the alliteration, the language, and all the musicality that entails. So it's an interesting, intellectual, satisfying idea to translate.
You talked about the some poems are challenging that you faced, right? So based on your experience, can you recount a particular poem or set of poems that gave you some difficulty or real challenge in moving the poem from one language to another?
Yes. One of the ones that I found quite difficult in the last few years, because I've only recently started translating from Italian, and I met an Italian writer called Eri De Luca a few years ago, and I was very taken by one of his short poems, which was about migrants. It's called a short, how would I say, a short, I can't remember the term really, but it's a very, very short poem about migrants as a kind of prayer for the migrants. So I decided to translate a series of his poems called Solo Andate, which is a sequence about migrants. And I found, first of all, because it was the start of my experience translating for Italian, I found that a challenge, because the translation had to reflect both the dramatic traits of the poem, which is about migrants crossing from Africa to Italy, and De Luca's typical rough language, because he's from Naples, so he has a very strong Neapolitan influence, which he uses in order to reflect the human condition of their passage. So the challenges I faced doing that was to included trying to reproduce De Luca's immediacy of De Luca's poetic style, because he's very direct, which, although it looks very simple, actually involves complex syntax and poetic tropes. Lots of metaphors, anaphors, etc. So I had to spend a lot of time trying to find the equivalences in English for his metaphors, etc., to fit into the terse rhythm and structure of his writing. So I did a draft and then another draft, and I was much indebted to my own translator into Italian, Guido Pupani, who was very well versed in well versed in English, and has an impeccable understanding of Italian. And he was able to revise the language and then help me guide my translation. So it was a challenge to try to reproduce the style and the nuances of the poem. Ultimately, it's a very laconic nature, a very laconic way of writing Mr. Deluca. But ultimately, it's very satisfying to get a good version of the poem. I'm continually revising it a little bit here and there. So that's probably about one of the most challenging works I've done. Often, I work closely with other. If I have a text that's quite challenging, I also work closely with other translators, like an English translator called Jan Lovelock, and we work closely discussing a translation of the French poet Serge Pay, who comes from the southwest of France and writes on sticks. And we discuss the terms and how to turn the phrases and the understanding of the rather cryptic language he works with. I also, again, working with Guido Kubani, because he translates my work and I translate his. And sometimes we work on a kind of collaborative translation. For example, a few years back, I translated a poem of his called Sonata Fugaza, and I did the English version and I showed it to him. And he, again, as I said, has a very good command of English. So therefore, he not only corrected some of the work that I was doing, but also decided to create his own view of the text in English. So essentially, he took it over and he said, I have to have, each line has to be 42 symbols. And then he decided to rework the style of the English. And we worked together to create a poem that was an original poem. So these kinds of things are not only interesting and to work on, challenging, but very satisfying.
That's a very good recounting of the collaborative translation, right? So multiple translators looking at the same text and really brainstorming. So it goes on to show how much it goes into the craft of translation. So one thing, I mean, we have been talking about translation, but you are essentially a poet and a translator. What gives you more joy, as a poet or as a translator?
I think they're both of them, but I think it's slightly different to an extent. I mean, I write my poetry. Sometimes the work comes without me being aware of the poems that I'm writing. So I write something down and say, oh yes, that actually works very well. And obviously when you work on it and you polish it, and then I'm very satisfied. So that is something that definitely gives me joy. Turning out a good translation is also very satisfying. And I think in both cases, when I read my own poetry or when I read a translation and the audience reacts positively to it, then that I think is the kind of key that says, well, this is something that is a job well done.
One thing I can say, Patrick, I mean, listening to you as you shared your experience as a translator as well as a poet, it gave, I think it gave us joy, and hopefully the listeners to this short discussion will get or share the joy as well. Thank you very much. Thanks for spending this time with us, giving your experience as a translator.
Thank you very much, Biswadip. It's been a pleasure to talk about it, and I hope that the readers find some insight as to what I've been talking about.